and welcome to the 905er. Coming out of the federal election, we are proud to once again focus more on regional matters and the things that are important to you here in the 905. Something caught our eye during the federal election, but we decided that we would wait until after the election to discuss it. Well, here we are after the election, so we're going to discuss it. Back in early April, a long-awaited report to Hamilton City Council was released. The report was by a citizen volunteer committee of 5 people to look at transparency and trust between Hamilton City Hall and the people they serve. The report gave a glaring condemnation of the city's relationship between its government and the people that they serve. An overwhelming 80% of respondents cited a lack of trust in Hamilton City Council. This report was met with a mixed reaction by councillors. Some dismissed the report as not having enough participants to make it worthwhile, while others cited the need to change to meet public expectations. This report, though, comes late into this council's term. Initially, it was meant to be produced at the start as a way to help guide them through this new term in office. We are now 1 year out from a general municipal election, and we are only now getting it. For a council that was elected as being the Change Council, this is working to help reinforce a feeling of broken expectations from Hamiltonians and their municipal government. What can be taken away from this and what can be done going forward? Well, to talk about this, I've invited back to the podcast Joey Coleman of thepublicrecord.ca. Longtime listeners of the show will no doubt be familiar with his work covering Hamilton City Hall. A link to his website is in the show notes. Have a listen. Okay, well, thank you, Joey Coleman from the Public Record, for once again sharing your time coming on the 905er to discuss. It's something that I've been wanting to discuss for a while, but we had that pesky federal election in the time being, and that is the matter of a recent survey from volunteers for Hamilton Council, giving it a Hamilton City Council a dismal score of transparency and accountability. Joey, thank you very much for coming on to talk about that with us today.
Thank you for having me.
It's been a few weeks now, so I think it's had a chance to kind of sit in the city council's well, if you will. And I'm wondering if you could tell me what's been the reaction from council on this survey that was initially released in the Hamilton Spectator on April 11th of this year.
Yeah, so I reported on the survey a couple days before that. Give me a moment here because I will have or I'll just restart this so that so I reported on the survey on April 7th when it was released. And I would say that much as is occurring in a wider society, the counselors' reactions have been based upon where they started from.
Mm-hmm.
So we've had only a few counselors who have said, this is serious. This reflects, it doesn't matter if this is scientific or not. It doesn't matter if we believe it's 80%, if we believe it should be 60%. The fact that a large segment of the public does not trust us is a severe problem. To the other end of the spectrum, where Ward 6 Councillor Tom Jackson felt that if they had done surveys in his ward, that people would overwhelmingly trust the city. All of which is to say that the real underlying thing to me is nobody was surprised by this.
Right.
There was nobody that said, whoa, 80%, what a shock. People might have said, wow, that was higher than I expected. And then you had, the commentary online from most people, which was, where's that other 20%? What's wrong with them? And I'll say this, the 80% public distrust is an achievement that's the result of decades of hard work by City Hall to undermine its own credibility, its own trust, and to earn the disdain of Hamiltonians. And this council, we're now in election season in Hamilton because we're going to have a by-election for one of the council seats. And so the 2026 election is underway. This council was elected on change. And what I hear overwhelmingly from people is disappointment. This task force itself was supposed to start within 90 days of the election, and its first meeting was on day 429. The only thing that's more out of whack with its budget was the tiny homes at Barton and Tiffany.
Right. Uh, it's been at the date of recording this, it's been almost a month, probably just over a month since it was released. And I'm wondering, have you seen? You're at City Hall on a daily basis. Are you seeing any change in behavior? Is it like maybe not like a formal? I know that city staff is still waiting to present a plan to put these findings into motion or into practice, but are you seeing any kind of the subtle changes in behaviors and in transparency, or just that city council, city staff kind of get like, okay, we need to change the playbook here?
Nothing yet. When I interviewed the city manager, she acknowledged the findings. She didn't dispute them. She didn't try to say anything against them, which is a good first step to say there's a problem and
Mhm.
not try to minimize it. She's hoping to have a report in the fall. And that's really all you can ask for from staff. At the end of the day, this was a mayor's task force. It was a political thing, and the mayor and the council need to take more ownership of it. Um, it's funny. I look back, and it was about a year and a half ago where I quibbed, and it was kind of a semi-sarcastic quib of frustration. I said, by the time that this task force report is available, it'll arrive just in time for candidates to put it in their platforms. And turning back to, we're in the 2026 election in Hamilton. I think the more interesting question is how do candidates take this into their
Mhm.
platform next year, the recommendations? I'll add that, yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, you mentioned how and this is, I think, what I think is really making this a bit of a headline is that this council was elected on a change platform. Um, you know, the old council was kind of a people said we're done with the games. We want things to get done, moving ahead. And Andrea Horvath was elected to lead this council through a change mandate. And I'm wondering how. I think you might have answered this question before, but I just want to get more concisely. Has this report kind of undermined the trust Hamiltonians have placed in this new council, or is it more just Hamiltonians are just kind of shrugging their shoulders, say, "Yeah, that's city council for you."
So I would say that it hasn't changed how people feel about the council. It's reinforced a feeling that they didn't enact, well, they just didn't enact change for the first year. They spent
Hmm.
their first year negotiating the early exit of the old city manager instead of doing what a change council does, which is thank you for your service, handshake, here's your parachute, we're moving forward with a new person. It took them a year and a half to get a new city manager in. And then they got hit with the cybersecurity failure, which is entirely the city's fault. That
Hmm.
was gross incompetence. Um, and now we're 2.5 years into the mandate. And I would say that people have not disengaged. They are not despairing. The disappointment is just sitting there. And people, I would say, my sense is people are hoping for vision next year, that they haven't given up on the city. They may have given up on this council. And it's unfortunate that this task force, because this task force report, sorry, let me restart that one. It's unfortunate that this task force report has come so late because the 5 citizens who volunteered their time to do it, who put such a great effort into it, are not well served by the fact that it will sit in stasis till the next council picks it up. This was an opportunity. Had this task force occurred within the first 90 days, the opportunity for momentum,
Hmm.
the fact that citizens of Hamilton said, get to work, that was lost. And in politics, when you lose the momentum, you lose the mandate.
You touched on something that I just popped in my head. Was the in your opinion, was this kind of set up to fail? You mentioned that was initially brought in when the council was first elected, as and the idea I would presume would have been to kind of give like a guiding light in terms of how to conduct themselves going forward. Yet here we are over 400 days into this new term, and we're just finally getting this released. To which case, yeah, the councilors have put in, yeah, we're going to reform and change and yada yada yada. What was what was the delay here? Like, what was this holdup to get this to the public?
Uh, so the first there was a delay in even getting the task force put together, and that entirely lands at the feet of Mayor Andrea Horvath. That was part of this last year where council was spending the entire first year trying to negotiate the exit of the city manager, trying to negotiate the exit of the city clerk, and they didn't get much done when they needed to be doing things. Uh, by the time that the task force gets started, they're now behind the eight ball. The cybersecurity failure occurs, so they can't meet for a while. Uh, the political atmosphere of council starts to break into isolated islands. We don't have factionalism. Well, a lot of councils will break into two, maybe three factions.
Hmm.
In our case, we have little globs of councillors that sometimes vote together in groups of 2 to 3, but there's no cohesive unit left. And so, in that environment, these citizens drop a report and there's no capacity to follow up. And that's really unfortunate because this report offers a lot of very basic things that a council could do
Right.
if they were still governing.
Well, let's touch on that because I in the report as it was released. I mean, these aren't really groundbreaking, huge, multi-million dollar innovative solutions. These are kind of things that I look and say this should have been already done
Well,
as a bare basics.
the recommendations that somebody be responsible for communications at the city, like somebody amongst the 28 communications managers and staff in the
Right.
city manager's office, amongst those 28 people, somebody should be responsible for communications. Say maybe the director of communications. Like that's not earth shattering. This idea that
Right.
28 people, which for those that follow Ontario municipalities, Hamilton's communications office is more than twice the size that it should be based upon the size of the city government. And even now, the report itself, they asked that the report be put on the main city website, and it's not on the main city website. These are not groundbreaking things. And that's probably getting back to this idea of disappointment that people were not asking. Well, it gets back to this point of disappointment. People were asking for this council to do a lot, and it unfortunately hasn't done much.
And why? I mean, we're taking a step back here and a bit more broader examination here. But why is that? I mean, does that come down to Mayor Horvath's leadership? Just, I mean, she's gotten a lot of criticism of just not kind of picking a direction to lead the city, or really what her priorities for the city might be in general. Is that how much of the blame does she carry for this?
Ultimately, the mayor, as the leader of council, is responsible for helping point in a direction. Remember that this term started with the mayor being first among equals,
Right.
not with strong mayor powers. Um, I would actually, interestingly, say that the fault that I would put on Mayor Horvath initially, beyond the negotiating with the city manager bit, is she tried too hard to find a consensus among council. They had a lot of meetings in the first 9 months to try to create a vision together.
Hmm.
And she wanted to have a very collaborative council. But at the end of the day, when you have 16 people, you still need to have a leader that very clearly helps guide that.
Hmm.
And so I would say that to the fault, it's not a absence of leadership. It was a attempt to be too collaborative in that leadership. And I would compare to say Burlington, where I know people have different viewpoints on these things, but the mayor there very clearly said, amongst the six counselors, you're going to lead this portfolio. You're going to be the expert on that portfolio. Everybody had an assignment and they got to work.
Well, I think the best example, and correct me if I'm wrong, was honestly the tiny shelter initiative that has kind of just stalled out a bit. Was that she got elected, or the council got elected to kind of, that's the kind of the first test. Where are we going to do this? How we're going to place this? And I'm just kind of getting shuffled around the city with some counselors saying, yes, we want it, but not in my ward. Others saying, well, this is a pointless endeavor altogether. There was no consensus. And I find that that has still just kind of pittered out because no one's taken the leadership to say, this needs to be done. We need to find a spot. Let's make it happen.
Yeah, and this is where so the hats issue. So that's
Yes.
separate from the Barton Tiffany issue. So this is hats. This is a private nonprofit group that has the funds to build a tiny house community. And
Right.
all they need is the land, municipal zoning, and some municipal support for servicing. And yes, exactly that. Every time it looks like they have a site, the site's selected, the ward counselor finds a way of saying it won't work in my backyard. And then we start the merry-go-round again. And at the end of the day, when no decision is made, everybody's unhappy. Um, I get, I live right near one of the men's emergency shelters. I actually this morning walked out my door and some of the litter from this morning was on my front driveway, and I was frustrated because I had cleaned last night. That's part of living in a community. And at the end of the day, a decision needed to be made. Some people would have been unhappy, but right now, nobody is satisfied. Everybody's going, this council can't get this done. And this ultimately gets back to politics. You have to make a decision.
Hmm.
You sometimes have to make an unpopular decision as part of a long term vision.
Absolutely. And I don't think there's a direct correlation, but I think there's a bit of a tie-in is that, Gore Park is seeing increased number of homelessness encampments, and whatnot. And now I'm not suggesting that the Hats project would solve that, but I think people are making the connection of, well, at least that's something. And at least if you start that and you say, oh, this works, we can maybe expand on a different program or a different expand on that to alleviate the homeless problem that is afflicting Hamilton. I know Hamilton's not unique in that regard, but people are turning to the city council to say, well, solve the problem in our backyard, and that's not getting done. And it's kind of bringing it back to this situation. That's a top priority for people, yet city council seems to be able to do nothing meaningful on that other than a few strong words or rants about homeless encampments.
Yeah, I would say that there's a lot of complexity.
Hmm.
Hats would be part of a broad-based solution. There are a lot of things that need to occur. We need to get housing built across this country, across the spectrum. And, last week, Hamilton City Council debated development charges. So one of our counselors looked at what Mississauga is doing, where Mississauga has given very targeted incentives to build 2 and 3 bedroom rental housing,
Hmm.
has cut a great deal of its red tape, also changed its rules, regulations, and payment schedules to help developers make the performa work to build rental with very strict rules to make sure that the developers live up to their end of the bargain. And what we got back last week at Hamilton City Council was a bunch of reasoning from city staff that Mississauga's program is not wise, that Mississauga is not going in the right direction, that Hamilton can't administratively do the things Mississauga is doing. And then you look at Mississauga, they've got 11,500 new units of housing in the permitting pipeline taking advantage of these incentives.
Hmm.
And yes, that's going to be market housing, but that's 11,500 more units of housing that are needed. And Hamilton's response was, well, we don't want to, like, that's just not working for us. Eventually, people will build. And I can't remember which counselor, but one of the counselors said, right now, nobody's building. We
Hmm.
need people to build. That needs to be our goal.
Okay, and again, bringing this conversation back to the original point, okay, if so, Hamilton city staff are saying this to council. Where's this data that they're presenting? They can't. Is it just a gut feeling, or because the question that people say is, okay, well, if you're a developer, you're saying, well, I want to build a apartment building in Hamilton. If their city staff saying no, you can't, you want to say, well, why can't I? What's the impediment here that I can work around? You can't do that if you don't have the data. And I'm just wondering, why is
So,
that so hard for city council or city staff to put this out there for people to work from?
so this on the finance side, city staff are arguing that decreasing development charges on family size rental units will result in financial difficulty for the city because the city is counting on one day, eventually, somebody building housing and collecting the development charges for that housing to
Hmm.
fund things. So when you're dealing with infill, you're generally not building a new rec center. You're building, so for example, our development charge study includes that new housing should pay for the runway expansion at the airport, that new housing should pay for a parking garage in downtown Hamilton. New housing also should pay for the need to expand pipes. But when you're building a new apartment building in the downtown, you're not building new roads, you're not building new sidewalks.
Right.
Expansion of sewers, generally speaking, is cost effective in that they have to be expanded over time as they're replaced. And you address, and this one counselor said, you're addressing the issue that we're having to put money out to give families rental subsidies because there's not enough rental housing, or we have to build social housing because there's not enough rental housing. And so staff have that argument. And this is where the politicians have to decide what is the greater good. There's also on the other side, and this isn't in the calculation, is that if we get a new rental unit built, a two-bedroom rental unit is going to pay about $2,500 a year in property tax. That's new property tax revenue we're not getting right now while we wait 10 years for somebody to build. So it turns back to staff put forth their position that they sincerely hold,
Hmm.
and staff need to balance and decide what is the greater good, what is the decision. Mississauga simply said, we need family units. So they're not giving tax breaks to single detached. They're not giving tax breaks to shoebox condos. They're giving over 25-year tax break for new rental housing with market rate caps because they need it. And they've determined that that's a greater good than not having development and hoping in the future to make money.
You're describing a situation where I, maybe I'm generalizing, but it seems that city staff has kind of have their head in the sand, and that to kind of break out of the box and say, well, I mean, the entire problem with the housing situation, that what we've been doing so far really hasn't worked to keep up with demand, and new innovative solutions might be needed to rethink all of it: funding, building codes, permits, etc. Um, Again, coming back to the accountability side of it, part of it is the public's input to say, well, no, this Mississauga solution might be good for Hamilton. Maybe city staff have it wrong, or maybe they're just not looking at it from the right perspective. Um, where's the city council to say, no, I really want to take a look at this Mississauga proposal? That might be like, maybe we don't have to copy it page for page, but there's got to be something. We're two equally sized cities. There's got to be something here that we can copy and paste into our plan and see if we can go forward. That's kind of part of the accountability part, is that are we just stuck in the same malaise of, well, we keep trying the same thing and nothing's working.
So on the staff side, yeah, there's a malaise. And the root of that is there's many roots. The part of it that can lay at the feet of council is that we've had good staff in the last decade and we lose them quickly
Hmm.
because we don't enable them to innovate or we don't treat them well and they go on to other places where they do really great things and deliver high value. And so there's that element of the council doesn't enable the staff to do their best. And so you end up with a staff that learns to keep their heads down.
Right. Right.
Um, you also, you've got a council where some of the councilors decide I've received 10 letters of opposition to a development. I'm going to oppose it. And 399 Green Hill, this was a 12-story or two 12-story rental development complex on a suburban plaza beside in a neighborhood that already has 15-story buildings beside two 11-story condo buildings. The people in the 11-story condo building said that 12 stories was not appropriate for their neighborhood. The ward counselor said, my residents want a grocery store there. They don't want residential housing. Council denied it on a tied vote. You may recollect that the federal conservative housing critic came to Hamilton and filmed a video in this plaza talking about this as a national example of gatekeeping. And staff get pummeled for recommending that housing. The developer has to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And the result is that these companies that build rental housing, which work across multiple jurisdictions, go, if I go to Hamilton, I don't know when I'm going to be able to build.
Hmm.
I don't know what my cost of building is going to be. I know my development charges are going to be high. If I go to Mississauga, they're guaranteeing me fast track approval. They've already pre zoned, so I don't have to get a new zoning amendment. And they've dropped their development charges substantially, provided I start building by November 2026. And the result is housing gets built in Mississauga. Turning to our other municipalities across the greater Toronto Hamilton area, what we have to do as municipalities, as cities, is decide what are our rules, standardize our rules, and make it very simple and consistent for developers to build the housing we need in an efficient manner. Because at the end of the day, we have a shortage of units, and that shortage of units is for everyone. We need to be building social housing, but we also have to enable the private market to efficiently build
Hmm.
private housing.
Yeah, and I before we logged on, I should also add. I was reading in the Niagara Falls Review how Niagara region is implementing a change in their policies, which with the intention of getting more housing built in the Niagara region. So if Hamilton is that, well, whether or not that works for Niagara is yet to be seen. But if it does, then Hamilton has really two fronts between Mississauga and Niagara that are attracting new development. You know, is it what happens to Hamilton when they are stuck in this malaise of just we're trying nothing and nothing's working and new
So,
housing's not being built, but yet two very popular destinations on either side of them, side of the city, are being built at good numbers.
so part of the challenge for Hamilton is there's only so many construction crews in the greater Toronto Hamilton area. We have a trade shortage. We have a trained construction worker shortage.
Hmm.
And already development, and this affects all the municipalities in the GTA, development is very quickly shifted to Mississauga to take advantage of those incentives, which let's remember, Mississauga said these incentives are only good till November 2026. You need to start building in 2026. So
Hmm.
already all that planning has occurred. The construction crews are hired, which means even if tomorrow Hamilton, let's, I will use the term race to the bottom because at a certain point, your incentives are no longer incentives, they're giveaways. There's a balancing there. If suddenly Hamilton tomorrow decided we're giving everything away, the construction crews are already taken up.
Hmm.
And so turning back to for everybody in the 2026 election upcoming, across the GTHA, the question that needs to be asked of candidates is how do you make housing possible? And that includes, and I ask this question, as you know, I interview every candidate in Hamilton's municipal election. I ask them, how would you deal with a development that meets all the planning tests, that fits in as missing middle, but the people who live nearby are opposed?
Mhm.
Do you vote in favor or do you vote opposed? And at the end of the day, candidates have to be able to articulate how they will build housing
Mhm.
in everybody's backyard.
That bring you raise a good point, and I want to tie it back into the topic of the episode, which is this issue of transparency. One of the solutions this report gave was better communications training um, for counselors to be able to go back to their constituents and explain council's decisions. I'm wondering how important that is in light of this, that there is a big NIMBY problem that we know we need to build housing, but the reaction is always like, but build it in somebody else's neighborhood, not in mine. Yet we're going to need counselors to come back and say, no, it's our turn. We need to bear our brunt of the housing load. That means a new condo tower, new apartment building, just new housing development, whatever the case may be. How important in your mind is that to get counselors, especially because we're going into an election cycle, to get new counselors on board with, you need to be able to communicate this to the people, not just feed into the NIMBYism, but get people on board with a city council's plan to address this.
So I'll say is that I have yet to encounter a situation where after something mid-rise, mid-density is built, that it's actually destroyed the neighborhood.
Uh, that's a different conversation altogether, but I'm going
Like,
to agree
but
with you
in
on
the
that.
sense that
Yeah,
I go to these places where people were screaming that this is going to destroy my neighborhood. And then they realize, actually, I like my new neighbors.
right,
And down the street, I now have this really cool cafe that I
right.
can walk to. There was a cartoon, and I wish I could recall who had done it, but it was circulating on social media of two people in Amsterdam enjoying themselves. And the one person saying, geez, if anybody ever tries to make my city like this, I'll kill them. Um, which is to say that leadership at times requires saying, we're building this, and then working with the developer to make sure that the impacts of development are
Mhm.
minimized. For example, on my neighborhood association, I live in downtown Hamilton. I met with a developer a couple years ago that was building new condo towers. And they were told, meet with the neighborhood association, hear what we need. And the only request that we had of the developer was make sure you're meeting all the planning documents and plans, that
Mhm.
you're meeting the construction guidelines, which requires sweeping the street on a daily basis when you're moving trucks in and out. Follow all the rules. We're the neighborhood association. We're not the city. And do not be moving your trucks in and out of the site 25 minutes before the school bell time, 15 minutes after in the morning, and in the afternoon, 5 minutes before the bell time and 20 minutes after. Basically, what was said is we don't want trucks crossing over the sidewalk when children are walking to school. Developer said yes. And that's the type of thing that a counselor should be focused on is how do you facilitate the development while minimizing the impact?
And that you bring up a good point, though. It's the lack of transparency coming from City Hall on this stuff kind of feeds into the NIMBYism. When people aren't informed and when they're not empowered on this information, they tend to take a very, well, I don't want it. I don't want it. Or it's going to change. It's going to change the character of the neighborhood, and it's always for the worse. It can never be for the better. Um, and I guess I'm looking at this from a viewpoint of the does this lack of transparency encourage bad behavior from councils? And I'm saying that because the lack of trust isn't just this council's responsibility. It's been built up over many terms with the Coots Paradise fiasco, the Red Hill Parkway fiasco, This time around, it's the cybersecurity matter at City Hall. And all of them, I think, come from the lack of trust that there's no communication from City Hall. And by communication, also a way to feed back into City Hall to have their people's voices and concerns heard, met, and that back and forth. Um, how important is it for City Hall to get this communication beat right so that the city of Hamilton can work together on meeting the needs of housing, as you said before, the need for new housing in Hamilton.
So turning to planning and to, public engagement in planning. One of the goals when the downtown secondary plan was created a decade ago in Hamilton, and the downtown secondary plan covers 4 different neighborhood associations, was to create a framework for development that made it easy for developers to know what they could build, that decreased the need for the neighborhood association to be involved in every detail of planning. So, as listeners may or may not be aware, you can build 30 stories in most of downtown Hamilton as of right with a site plan. No public meeting needed. You have to meet shadow requirements, you have to meet design requirements, wind studies. There's a whole bunch of rules.
Mhm.
The result is that a lot is getting built. And I've actually found that my neighbors are less angry than when we used to have years of meetings on every development. But part of it is that the plan is very clearly communicated. People know what can be done and what cannot be done. And at the end of the day, I value clarity. I think that at the end of the day, people want to know what's going to happen, how it can happen. And sometimes people just won't be happy. There's one person in my neighborhood who is now okay with the new housing, but they moved into downtown Hamilton. And then they said, well, I moved here to get away from living in downtown Toronto. I don't want towers near me. And I remember saying to them, it's the downtown.
Right.
Um, and at the end of the day, that's really what it comes down to is clarity. And communications is not, we're going to have 20 public meetings on this. Communications is, here's what it is, here's how your interests are protected, and here's who to contact if it's not being done properly.
Going forward, I know, as you said, we're having a by-election in Hamilton to replace one of the councillors. But going past that, there's still a few years left on this council's term before a broader general election. In your opinion, what's going to be needed for the council to fix this transparency issue and to rebuild some of that trust, rather than let this sit and say, "Oh, the next council has to take this on," which I suspect just means it gets put in a drawer and forgotten about again for another term in office. What do you think needs to be done to kind of change this perception at City Hall?
I will say, unfortunately, with a year left in this term, I don't have much hope that anything's going to improve. There'll be a whole bunch of things they'll do right before the election,
Hmm.
but the underlying culture change has not occurred. And it's not just Hamilton that has this culture problem. Um, if there was one thing that I would change in all municipalities, is I would have public delegations in a much more streamlined manner. I would have the American style where, the person gets 3 or 5 minutes, they go up, they make their pitch, and they get to sit down. And if the counselors have a follow up question, they do it at the end of groups of delegates. Um, and that no matter what the delegate says, they're treated with respect and sincerity. I think that would go a long way. Right now, our delegation processes throughout the Greater Toronto Hamilton area are very ad hoc. They're difficult to navigate, and the councils tend to treat delegates with hostility. There'll always be 1 or 2 counselors that will be hostile to delegates. And I draw an example of the old Ontario Municipal Board, where Dr. Bruce Kirschnicki, PhD, was executive chair of the board. in 2017 when Hamilton had its ward boundaries. And all the delegates, dozens of delegates, were treated with great respect by him. And he made sure there was one delegate that the city's lawyer was planning to try to aggressively cross examine. And I never forget Dr. Krishnecki turning to the lawyer for the city and saying, this person is a guest of the tribunal and they will be treated kindly as a guest. And that kindness would be a long way to helping in this council term. And it's advice that every municipal council could take.
Well, it says something. The idea of that municipal government is the closest level of government to those of us on the street. I mean, if you think about it, we have more interaction with our municipal governments than we do the provincial and definitely with the federal government. Yet, you're right. There's that. Maybe that's what breeds this kind of animosity or distrust. Is that yeah? When somebody's saying, I need better garbage collection in my neighborhood," or I need potholes filled because I'm bottoming out my car when I go to on my way to work, it hits a lot more urgent and a lot more closer to home than say, a carbon tax would.
At the end of the day, I've seen it so many times where the counselors feel a need to correct somebody who doesn't understand the complexities of
Hmm.
municipal government. They feel a need to one up the delegate,
Right.
and it serves no purpose. Uh, I often think about, all of us as we grow in our leadership and we grow in our abilities and experiences are entrusted with greater levels of responsibility.
Hmm.
And with that comes a duty of care towards others. And, I sit there and I've seen people delegate and they're completely wrong.
Hmm.
So be it. There's no need to tell them you're completely wrong when they're wrong in good faith.
But you could, I mean, you would tell. There's a difference between being wrong and just being I have different information than you. I'm giving my presentation because I've been given this information. It might be gaps. It might be you might be fed misinformation, which is often the case these days. But again, coming back to the transparency issue, at the end of the day, if council passes a decision that goes against that misinformation, I don't see the harm in putting the reasoning into that decision to say this isn't the way that it's going to work. We've done the study; it will impact this neighborhood in this manner, or it will not cause an increase in property tax. Whatever the misinformation is, say this is the reason why. And you can see it on the website again, the digital complaints, and just empowering counselors to say this was the reasoning why this decision was made. It's not because you're stupid. It's not because you're a malcontent. It's just these are the facts. This is the truth of the matter.
So there's that, which is at the end of hearing the delegations, explaining the reasoning based upon what you've heard from the delegates. What we often see at our municipal councils
Right.
is confronting the delegate, ch- making them have to lose face in the process.
Right.
So, for example, the issue of grocery stores, which comes up all the time. Everybody wants a grocery store across the street from them,
Hmm.
but they like to go to Costco to buy most of their groceries. So they want a store for, oh, geez, I suddenly need one single item. I'd rather cross the street.
Hmm.
But a grocery store can't make a sustainable business off of selling 3 loaves of bread a day.
Right.
And so people want a grocery store, but they drive to Costco. And there's this disconnect. And as a council, you'll hear a bunch of people say, this used to be a grocery store. You shouldn't allow them to develop it. They should be required to open
Hmm.
a grocery store. You hear those delegates, and then at the end, you explain the economics. You say, groceries have changed. People go to No Frills, Costco, so forth, so on. This is not within our power. I'm sympathetic to your desire.
Hmm.
And hopefully, so for example, going to 399 Green Hill, there's an expansion of the commercial space in the settlement agreement at the OLT. hopefully that commercial space becomes the convenience store that you can get bread and milk at. But there's not a need to, at every single delegate, confront the people about that and explain to them. You do it at the end.
Mhm.
And that's what I'm getting at. I always am disappointed when somebody takes the time to delegate and they have a negative experience because the interaction is not professionally handled.
Is I mean, I part of that I wonder is how much of that is showboating, which is always no matter what level of politics you're at, there's always got to be a bit of ego at play. Something that I've kind of come across in doing this podcast is how removed from consequences municipal level of government is. That you mentioned the OLT a few times in this episode, and how many times does a decision get overpassed by the municipal government that they have to be held accountable to the people for a decision for yes or no, but it gets passed on to the OLT, which makes the ultimate decision. So at the end of the day, I mean, this is just a microcosm, but a municipal government says, well, I don't really have enough power. All I can do is raise or lower your property taxes. But the provincial government is the one who's going to come in and say, with municipal minister zoning orders, we're going to put this here, X there, and you don't have any say over it. I get to say, I don't like it. I'm with you. Boo, boo, government. But at the end of the day, you don't have to own the decision. You don't have to come back and say, yes, I think that building unit, that building tower needs to go there, or we should we should authorize this business to go in this neighborhood, and I'm going to defend it to you. Which again means that you don't have to be quite so confrontational. You might have to win people over and put a bit of the charm on, as I say. What's your take on that? Is there anything to play there?
So yeah, I mean, we have poorly behaving municipal councilors in a few municipalities. I actually was thinking a lot about this week because of the fact that I've been highlighting some of the worst behaving councilors in the province. And there's 444 municipalities. Um, there's probably 4,000, 5,000 municipal politicians in Ontario, and there's about a dozen of them that are terribly misbehaving.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually not a bad ratio when you think about the number of them.
True.
It's Bill Dennis in Sarnia. He's been one of the worst offenders in the province, and something's happened to him in the last few months. And I suspect what it is that people have been watching his behavior and telling him this is not acceptable. You're not defending our interests. He was doing the whole populist thing, and now he's moderating his behavior. We as a society need to hold our own ideologically aligned politicians to decorum and responsibility. And I go back to Bill Davis, like he issued an apology, which when I read it, I was like, wait a second, this is a guy who a year ago was the most belligerent councillor in Ontario. And what it comes down to is people said to him, hey, we agree with you on let's get rid of encampments. Let's get rid of like he's very much on that. Let's take a hard line on things. But boy, stop accusing your opponents of being terrible people. That's what we need to do. You're always going to have the politicians who pander. But if we expect a certain level of decorum and respect from our politicians, they're going to live up to it. And we can't reward bad behavior by clicking like and heart on social media.
You know what? I think that's where we're going to leave this episode. Words to live by. Thank you very much, Joey, for coming on, talking about this. We'll see if anyone on Hamilton City Council heeds your call to strive for the best. Thank you very much for coming on today.
Pleasure was mine. Have a good one.
Bye bye.